The moment my son-in-law pulled me aside at Thanksgiving dinner and whispered, "Check your life insurance policy tonight, before you go to sleep," I thought he was overreacting. That was a mistake I almost didn't recover from. My name is Arthur. I'm 68 years old, retired after 32 years working in commercial property management in Phoenix, Arizona. I have a daughter named Lily, a son named Owen, and a son-in-law named Felix who married Lily 11 years ago. Felix is quiet, methodical, the kind of man who reads the fine print on everything, which used to drive me crazy at family dinners when he'd spend 20 minutes analyzing the menu before ordering a burger. That night I was grateful for every single one of those habits. My wife Beverly passed away 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the day I stood in the rain at Scottsdale Memorial Park and watched them lower her casket. She was the kind of woman who remembered every birthday, kept every card, and still had a drawer full of coupons she'd clipped in 2019. Losing her didn't just break my heart. It broke my routine, my sense of direction, everything I'd built my days around for 41 years. Owen stepped in almost immediately. He came by the house the week after the funeral with a yellow legal pad, and what I can only describe as a project manager's energy. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where Beverly and I used to do the crossword puzzle every Sunday morning, and he laid out a plan. He wanted to help me get organized, review my accounts, consolidate my investments, simplify my estate documents. At the time, I thought it was grief channeled into productivity. Owen had always been the practical one. Beverly used to joke that he came out of the womb with a spreadsheet. I was 66 years old, freshly widowed, and exhausted in ways I didn't even have words for, so I let him help. Over the next several months, Owen took me to meet with a financial advisor he'd found, a man named Greg Fairbanks, whose office was in a strip mall in Tempe, which should have been my first warning sign, but I was not in a state to notice things like that. Greg was friendly, well-dressed, had framed certificates on his wall and a firm handshake. He walked me through some adjustments to my portfolio, talked about streamlining, and at one point slid a set of documents across the desk for me to sign. Owen was sitting right next to me. "It's just a beneficiary update, Dad," he said. "Keeps everything current." I signed. I didn't read it carefully. I trusted him. That was my mistake. Not the only one I made in those months, but the one that nearly cost me everything. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that Owen had also been working on something else entirely. Something he'd been building quietly, patiently, the way you build a wall brick by brick until the day you realize you're standing on the wrong side of it. Beverly had a life insurance policy, $280,000. We'd paid into it for over 20 years. The beneficiary had always been me. Then, if I predeceased her, the benefit would split equally between Owen and Lily. Somewhere in those months of getting organized, Owen had changed the primary beneficiary to himself, sole beneficiary. Lily's name removed entirely. I didn't find this out until Thanksgiving. We were all gathered at Owen's house in Chandler. It was the first big holiday since Beverly died, and Owen had insisted on hosting. At the time I thought that was generous. His wife, Claudette, had made sweet potato casserole and a turkey that was slightly overcooked, but nobody said anything. Felix and Lily drove down from Flagstaff, and their 2 kids, twins aged 7, ran circles around the dining room table until Claudette told them to go watch something in the playroom. It was a normal Thanksgiving. Loud, a little chaotic, full of the particular warmth that comes from people who are trying very hard to make things feel normal. After dinner, Felix asked me to come outside with him to look at something in his truck. I assumed he had an early Christmas gift he didn't want the kids to see. I grabbed my jacket and followed him out to the driveway. He didn't open the truck. Instead, he stood in the cold Arizona evening. It was maybe 50 degrees, which in Phoenix feels Arctic, and he looked at me with an expression I didn't know how to read. Felix is not an expressive man. 11 years of knowing him, and I can count on one hand the times I've seen him visibly upset. That night was one of them. "Arthur," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." I told him, of course. "Did you intentionally remove Lily from Beverly's life insurance policy?" I didn't understand the question at first. I asked him to repeat himself. He did, and then something cold moved through me that had nothing to do with the November air. I told him I hadn't changed anything intentionally. I told him about the documents at Greg Fairbanks's office, the beneficiary update Owen had called routine. Felix nodded slowly, like he'd already suspected this but had needed to hear me say it. He pulled out his phone and showed me a document he'd photographed. "I don't know how he got it," he explained later, but in that moment I was too stunned to process logistics. It was a beneficiary designation form, my signature at the bottom, and where Beverly's policy had always listed Arthur Lennox, primary, Lily Navarro, contingent, Owen Lennox. Contingent, there was now only one name, Owen Lennox, primary, 100%. My hands were shaking, not from the cold. Felix told me that he'd noticed something was off about 3 months earlier. He worked in financial compliance, commercial lending, mostly, and he'd developed a habit over the years of reviewing any financial documents that came through family circles. Not out of nosiness, but out of professional instinct. Lily had mentioned offhand that Owen had been helping me get my affairs in order, and something about the way she described it made Felix want to take a closer look. He had a contact at the insurance company, someone he'd worked with on a business case years ago, and he'd made a discreet inquiry. What came back had made him sit in his car in the parking lot of a Walgreens for 45 minutes before driving home to tell Lily. He hadn't told me sooner because he wanted to be certain. He wanted documentation. He wanted something solid before he walked into a situation like this. Standing in that driveway, I understood something I hadn't understood before. I understood that while I'd been grieving, while I'd been leaning on my son and believing he was steadying me, Owen had been repositioning himself. Not to help me, to help himself. I thought about the yellow legal pad, the strip mall financial advisor, the easy reassurance. It's just a beneficiary update, Dad. I thought about Beverly, about all the years she'd paid into that policy, through lean years and good years, because she wanted to know that if something happened to her, the people she loved would be taken care of. All three of us. Together, Owen had erased Lily from that. Felix was watching me. He didn't say anything, just waited. I had two choices in that moment. I could walk back inside, confront Owen at the dinner table, turn Thanksgiving into a catastrophe, and give Owen the chance to explain it away or destroy evidence before I had anything solid enough to act on. Or I could say nothing. Go back inside, eat the rest of the pie Claudette had made, hug my grandchildren, and let Felix and me figure out the right way to handle this. I chose the second option. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Sitting across from my son for the rest of that evening, watching him pour coffee and laugh at something on television and ruffle his nephew's hair. Knowing what I now knew. I can't fully explain what that felt like. There's a kind of grief that comes from realizing someone you love is not who you believe them to be. It doesn't hit you all at once, it seeps in, and you have to sit very still and let it seep and not react and smile when someone passes you the pie. I drove home alone that night, sat in my driveway for a long time before going inside. The house was quiet. Beverly's reading glasses were still on the side table by the couch. I haven't moved them. I keep meaning to and I can't. I sat in her chair and I thought about what to do next. The following Monday, I called my own attorney, a woman named Barbara Kimball, who I'd used for the property management business years ago and trusted completely. I did not use the attorney Owen had suggested at one point. I went back to Barbara. I told her everything. She was quiet on the phone for a moment after I finished, then she said, "Arthur, I want you to get me every document you signed in the last 2 years. Every single one. And I want you to do it without letting Owen know you're doing it." I spent the next 6 weeks doing exactly that. It was meticulous, tedious, and deeply disorienting work. Going through papers I'd barely looked at when I signed them. Requesting copies from the insurance company, from Greg Fairbanks's firm, from the financial institution where I'd moved some of my retirement accounts on Owen's advice. Felix helped me. He came down from Flagstaff twice, and we sat at my kitchen table where Beverly and I used to do crosswords, and we went through everything line by line. What we found was worse than I'd anticipated. The beneficiary change on the life insurance policy was the most obvious piece, but it wasn't the only one. Owen had also had me sign a durable power of attorney document, one of the papers in that stack at Greg Fairbanks' office that I'd assumed was routine estate planning. The POA was worded broadly enough that if Owen had chosen to exercise it, he would have had significant authority over my financial decisions, including the ability to make changes to my accounts, my investments, and potentially my living situation, with limited oversight. He hadn't used it yet. But it was there, waiting. Barbara explained what this meant in plain terms. Owen had been building infrastructure. Quiet, legal-looking infrastructure. The kind that, if I'd become incapacitated or simply hadn't been paying attention, would have given him enormous control over my estate while Lily was slowly written out of the picture. "This is elder financial abuse," Barbara said, and hearing those words applied to my own situation was like being splashed with cold water. I was not someone this happened to. I was a grown man, a former business owner, a person who had managed commercial real estate portfolios for 3 decades, and yet there it was. When I asked Barbara why she thought Owen had done this, she was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "it's not about need. It's about opportunity, and a story someone tells themselves about who deserves what. I've thought about that a lot since. Owen had always been my practical child. He'd also always had an undercurrent of resentment toward Lily that Beverly and I had tried to address over the years. About perceived favoritism. about the fact that Lily had moved away while Owen stayed close to us in the valley. Those old wounds had never fully healed, and somewhere in the fog of my grief, Owen had apparently decided that Beverly's death was his window to settle a score I hadn't even known was still on the table. By February, 3 months after Thanksgiving, Barbara had built a complete picture. She'd contacted the Arizona Department of Insurance, filed a complaint, and worked with a private investigator who documented Owen's ongoing contact with Greg Fairbanks, including evidence that Fairbanks had received a referral payment from a financial products company for steering my retirement funds into instruments that paid him handsomely and were not particularly well suited to my situation. It wasn't just Owen. Fairbanks was part of it, a willing participant who saw an elderly widower brought in by a trusted family member and decided that was a business opportunity. The beneficiary designation was reversed. Barbara handled that directly with the insurance company. The change had been made without my informed consent, and they cooperated fully once the documentation was presented. The POA was revoked, and then Barbara referred the full file to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. I didn't tell Owen any of this was happening. He called me every week or two, same as usual. Asked how I was doing, mentioned he was planning to come by and help me reorganize the garage in the spring. I talked to him normally, asked about Claudette, asked about work. It was the strangest performance of my life, and I can only explain it by saying that I had decided, very deliberately, that I was not going to let my grief and my anger rush me into giving Owen any warning. He had taken his time building what he built. I was going to take my time dismantling it. In March, 2 investigators from the Maricopa County Attorney's Financial Crimes Unit came to my house. They sat at that same kitchen table and took a statement from me that lasted almost 3 hours. They were thorough, professional, and kind in the way that people are kind when they've had to deliver terrible news many times before, and have learned to do it gently. 2 weeks after that, Owen Lennox was arrested at his home in Chandler on charges of financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud, and conspiracy, the last charge in connection with Greg Fairbanks, who was being prosecuted separately on related counts. I heard about the arrest from Barbara, who called me on a Tuesday morning. I was in the backyard when my phone rang. The citrus trees Beverly planted the year we moved into the house were in bloom. She used to love them in March. I stood there with my phone in my hand for a long time after I hung up. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that, because I think people expect that when justice happens, you feel some clean, bright version of relief. What I felt was mostly tired and sad, and something I still don't have a name for. The particular sadness of being right about something you desperately wished you were wrong about. Owen's initial appearance in court was 2 weeks later. I did not attend. Lily did. She came back to Phoenix for it, and she and Felix stayed with me that week. I was glad not to be alone in the house, though none of us talked much about what was happening. We watched a lot of old movies, ate takeout. The twins called on FaceTime and showed me a school project about the solar system, and I asked them serious questions about Jupiter's moons, and for a little while everything felt almost normal. The case took 8 months to fully resolve. Owen pleaded guilty to 2 of the 3 charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was ordered to pay full restitution, which in practical terms meant restoring the life insurance policy to its correct beneficiaries, unwinding the financial products Greg Fairbanks had moved my retirement funds into, and reimbursing the legal and investigative costs I'd incurred. He received 30 months of probation, mandatory financial ethics counseling, and a permanent civil judgment on his record. Fairbanks surrendered his license and received a separate criminal fine. I know some people reading this will think the outcome was too lenient. Some days I think that too. But I am also 68 years old, and I have learned that I do not have the energy to carry rage as a long-term project. What I have is a restored policy with the right names on it, a revoked POA, a daughter who knows her father didn't abandon her, and a son-in-law who stood in a cold driveway on Thanksgiving and decided that doing the right thing was worth the discomfort of saying it out loud. If I could go back and tell myself one thing, the Arthur who sat across from a strip mall financial advisor and signed papers without reading them, the Arthur who was so tired from grief that he let his son do his thinking for him, I would tell him this: the people who love you will not always be the people who are related to you. Sometimes it's the quiet man who reads the fine print on everything. Sometimes it's the person you underestimated for years. And I would tell him to read every single document before he puts his name on anything. Beverly would have read every word. She always did. I should have known better than to sign something she hadn't seen. The citrus trees are still blooming. I have her reading glasses on the side table. And every Sunday morning, I still do the crossword. Alone, but with her chair pulled a little closer to mine, because some habits are worth keeping even when the person who started them is gone. Some things, it turns out, You don't let anyone take from you.